Hello, and welcome back to the quiet bedtime tonight. We journey to a place in time synonymous with boundless promise, where the very dust of the earth was said to be flecked with fortune. California in the mid-19th century. The year is 1849. The word has traveled the globe gold, not just a trace, not just a rumor, but millions of dollars waiting to be plucked from the rivers and hillsides of a mostly unknown territory. The lure of this treasure pulled hundreds of thousands of souls from every corner of the planet, igniting one of the most significant mass migrations in human history. But tonight, we will not focus on the glittering nuggets or the rapid rise of cities. We will leave the legends and the sweeping dramas behind. Instead, we will quietly, slowly, and methodically explore a different reality. One lived day to day by the average person in the dust-choked, frozen, and unforgiving gold camps. The history we find there is one of grueling, continuous labor, of simple, soul-crushing disappointment, and of the profound loneliness that came with the singular pursuit of a metal that rarely showed itself. It is a story of how a small, almost microscopic, flake of gold dust became the entire axis on which a person's life could turn. So, as the music gently washes over you, allow your mind to slow down, release the thoughts of your own day and the demands of tomorrow. We are going to drift back to a time of pickaxes and canvas tents, to the sound of rushing river water, and the distant, muffled cough of a feverish man. Settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin our journey into the hidden truths of the American gold rush. Imagine yourself, for a moment, arriving in the California foothills. You have survived the months-long journey, the grueling sea voyage around Cape Horn, or the punishing overland trek across the prairies and mountains. You are perhaps thinner than when you started. Your clothes are likely threadbare, and the singular, burning image of gold is the only thing that has sustained your spirit. You are here, in the land of opportunity. The first reality that settles over you is one of profound disorder. The gold camps were not towns. They were sprawling, temporary agglomerations of canvas, rough lumber, and men. Almost exclusively men. There was no established rhythm, no municipal structure, and very little law except the rough, immediate code of the camp itself. Your immediate need is to secure a place to work, a claim. This might be a stretch of riverbank or a section of a dry creek bed. The size of the claim was often determined by a local agreement, or more often, by sheer physical presence. Once staked, the hard, unromantic, and utterly exhausting work began. The popular image of the gold rush centers on the simple act of panning. And indeed, panning was the most democratic and immediate method of separating the precious metal from the mundane silt and gravel. But this simple act was, in reality, a form of sustained, repetitive, and bone-chilling physical torture. Imagine standing in a rushing mountain stream, sometimes for 10, 12, or even 14 hours a day. The water, fed by melting snow from the high Sierras, was icy cold, even in the height of summer. You are not wearing sophisticated waterproof gear. Your trousers and boots are likely sodden within minutes, and they will remain so until you collapse into your tent at night. The process itself required an exacting form of drudgery. You would shovel heavy gravel and sediment from the riverbed into a large, flat-bottomed pan. That pan, now weighted with water and earth, might weigh 10 or 15 pounds. You then had to stand, hunched over, and begin the rhythmic, circular motion swirling the water, allowing the lighter materials to wash over the side while the heavier gold, owing to its superior density, theoretically settled at the bottom. This motion was repeated, hour after hour. The constant, unnatural, hunching position strained the lower back and shoulders. The continuous immersion in near-freezing water led to rheumatism and constant, dull aches in the joints. The hands, perpetually wet and subject to the abrasive silt, became cracked, calloused, and often infected. The air might be thick with the sound of the shovels scraping against stone and the rhythmic swish of hundreds of pans being worked. And for all this labor, the reward was rarely the gleaming, palm-sized nugget of legend. It was usually color. A few fine specks of gold dust, often only enough to cover the cost of the meager rations you needed to survive the day. The true emotional toll came not from the work itself, but from the soul-crushing disappointment of day after day of nothing. A moment of hope as the heavy materials collected in the pan's riffles, followed by the inevitable, sinking realization that it was merely iron. Pirate fool's gold or just another pile of common stones? Now, consider the cost of existence in this rough, desolate economy. The gold itself created a bizarre, hyperinflated market. Merchants, those who had the foresight to bring essential supplies, commanded astronomical prices. Think of simple, life-sustaining items. A pound of flour, which might cost a few pennies back east, could cost $1 in gold dust. A single egg could be $3. A pair of boots Vito for working in the streams could fetch upwards of $50. Fresh fruit and vegetables, the very things needed to stave off disease, were luxury goods, entirely unobtainable for most. This high cost meant that a miner was constantly in a state of desperation. He was not working for wealth. He was working, often at a loss, simply to fund the next day's labor. A few days of sickness or a week of bad luck could wipe out his entire grub stake and force him into debt, or worse, starvation. And sickness was an ever-present, insidious threat. The conditions of the camps were a breeding ground for disease. Sanitation was non-existent. Waste was disposed of poorly, often draining directly into the same river water that was used for drinking and cooking. The limited diet composed mostly of salt pork, hardtack, and black coffee lacked essential vitamins. The most common, and perhaps most feared, ailment was dysentery, or the flux. This debilitating intestinal illness swept through the camps with terrifying speed. Imagine the physical drain, the loss of strength, and the constant, painful trips to the latrine, all while being miles from a real doctor, surrounded by men who could offer little more than whiskey as a remedy. This condition, combined with scurvy, a terrifying disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, leading to bleeding gums, loosened teeth, and open sores, turned the pursuit of gold into a desperate struggle against the decay of the physical body. Life was indeed brutally cut short by these unseen, microscopic enemies, far more often than by gunfights. The psychological toll was perhaps the most enduring hardship. You were surrounded by men, but intensely alone. The singular, obsessive focus on the gold meant that meaningful companionship was rare. Trust was fragile. The constant fear of claim jumping meant you could never truly let your guard down. You had to sleep with one eye open, guarding your meager equipment and your hard-won claim. This relentless, monotonous isolation and physical pain led to widespread gambling and heavy drinking. Men sought refuge from the disappointing reality in the temporary oblivion offered by whiskey, often leading to debt, despair, and, occasionally, violence. As we shift our focus from the frozen riverbanks of the gold fields, we turn now to the terrifying struggle of those who were attempting to reach them. The promise of California drove people to undertake risks that, in retrospect, seem almost unimaginable. Among all the stories of the overland journey, few resonate with such a profound and lasting chill as that of the Donner Party. The fate of this group, beginning in the spring of 1846, serves as a stark, horrifying contrast to the comfortable existence we enjoy today. It is a story not of wealth, but of the complete, total breakdown of civilization in the face of absolute wilderness and overwhelming circumstance. We will approach this narrative with sensitivity, focusing on the psychological and emotional strain of their final, desperate weeks, acknowledging the grim realities without lingering on graphic details. The true tragedy of the Donner Party lies in a decision made early in their journey, attempting to take a purportedly shorter route known as Hastings Cutoff. This decision led them across difficult, unknown terrain, resulting in significant delays and the loss of precious resources, including oxen and wagons. By the time they reached the eastern side of the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains, the calendar had betrayed them. It was late October, 1846, and the earliest, heaviest snows the region had seen in decades were about to begin their inexorable descent. Imagine yourself among this group, primarily families, men, women, and children, now exhausted, undersupplied, and deeply worried. They arrived at Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, hoping to clear the final, high mountain putt. The snow began, not a gentle flurry, but a fierce, blinding storm that rapidly piled feet upon feet of white silence, effectively sealing them into the high mountains. They found rudimentary shelter. Some built rough cabins from pine logs near the lake. Others, including the Donner family itself, were stuck a few miles back, sheltering under canvas awnings and tree boughs. The number of survivors initially trapped was around 81 people. The resources they had were inadequate. Some flour, some dried meat, and a dwindling supply of livestock that soon either wandered off or had to be consumed immediately. The winter set in with savage intensity. The temperatures plummeted far below freezing, and the snow piled up to depths of 22 feet in places, creating an inescapable, blinding white prison. The environment was overwhelming. The days merged into an excruciating monotony of cold, hunger, and waiting. We focus now on the emotional toll during those final, desperate months of December 1846 and January 1847. By mid-December, realizing their situation was terminal, a small group of 15 men and women, known as the Forlorn Hope, decided upon the most desperate gamble. They strapped crude snowshoes fashioned from oxbows and rawhide to their feet and began their attempt to walk out over the high passes, seeking help at the settlements near Sutter's Fort, over 100 miles away. Imagine that walk. The silence broken only by the swoosh of the snowshoes and the ragged breath of the hikers. They were weak from months of near starvation. The glare of the sun on the vast, unbroken snowfield was blinding. Their progress was excruciatingly slow, measured in miles per day, not dozens. Their meager provisions ran out entirely within days. The days passed, blurring into an agonizing sequence of cold nights and painful mornings. The cold, unrelenting wind chiseled away at their remaining body heat and mental fortitude. As the first members of the party succumbed to weakness and exposure, the living faced a succession of harrowing choices necessary for their continued, fragile existence. This was the moment where the thin veneer of social convention entirely vanished, replaced by the primal, inescapable will to survive. The cost of life was now measured in the complete loss of all that they held sacred. The group fractured further, physically and emotionally. Those who were too weak to continue were left behind, often with promises to return, promises that everyone knew could not possibly be kept. The psychological burden of these decisions was immense. Imagine the last moments of saying goodbye, knowing the finality of the act, the ultimate price of their delay. We follow the survivors, now fewer than 10, struggling through the frozen wilderness. Their clothes were shredded, their skin blackened by frostbite, their minds consumed by the singular, burning ache of hunger. The historian can only look back and acknowledge that the experience of this extremity, this profound stripping away of humanity, defines the horror of the Donner Party. Life had become a constant minute-by-minute battle against the failing body. In January, the survivors, barely recognizable as the people who had begun the journey, finally stumbled into the first Native American settlements, and eventually to the safety of the settlements in the Sacramento Valley. Of the 15 who started the Forlorn Hope, only 7 survived. News of the survivors' state and the gruesome circumstances of their survival finally reached Sutter's Fort. This triggered a series of relief parties, the efforts to save those still trapped at Truckee Lake and the Donner family camp. For the people waiting in the cabins, hope had dwindled to a cold cinder. They had resorted to eating hides, boiled into a miserable, glue-like broth. The final sight of the first rescue party was a moment of profound, painful relief. Imagine the wave of emoshanda weeping. The near collapse as strangers appearing like angels in the blinding snowscape, bringing the first tastes of real food they had known in months. However, the relief parties could only evacuate people in small groups. The subsequent trips back into the mountains were fraught with peril. More people died attempting the journey out than died within the cabins. Children, frail and exhausted, had to be carried. The effort was immense, and the strain on the rescuers themselves led to more suffering. By the time the final rescue party arrived in April 1847, they found a scene of profound desolation and silence. Only a single survivor, Louise Kesseberg, was found amidst the corpses and the ruins of the cabins. The story of the Donner Party is not about the gold. It is about the cost of the American dream. It shows us the deep-seated, terrifying vulnerability of the human body and mind when faced with an environment that refuses to yield. It is a harsh reminder that the journey to fortune was often fatal, and that the beautiful, untouched Sierra Nevada could be transformed into a vast, silent graveyard. Let the image of that deep, insulating snow begin to recede, and the warmth of your own room reassert itself. We move now from the verifiable recorded tragedies of the journey to the enduring, whispered mysteries that the gold rush left behind in its wake. The story is centered in the forbidding, stark beauty of the Superstition Mountains in Arizona, an unforgiving landscape of jagged peaks and deep, shadowed canyons. The terrain itself seems designed to conceal secrets, intimidating and vast. The legend, or a collection of legends, stretches back to the 1840s, well before the official California gold rush, suggesting that the area was rich with gold, known only to a select few. The most popular version centers on a man named Jacob Waltz, a German immigrant who was supposedly working the mine in the 1870s and 1880s. Waltz, known locally as the Dutchman, the common corruption of Dutch, claimed to have discovered a phenomenally rich gold vein. He would periodically appear in the nearby town of Phoenix with large, incredibly rich gold specimens, often quartz speckled heavily with the shining metal, only to disappear back into the vast, inaccessible reaches of the Superstitions. The mystery begins with Waltz's death in 1891. On his deathbed, he allegedly described the mine's location to Julia Thomas, a boarding house owner who had cared for him. However, the directions were frustratingly vague, full of landmarks that changed with the season or were simply impossible to definitively identify. The shadow of the finger points at 4 o'clock, or near a mountain that resembles a woman's breast. Imagine the scene. A dying man, consumed by fever and memory, whispering coordinates that only he understood. The details of the mine itself are part of the allure. It is said to be an open cut, mean a vertical shaft that is cunningly hidden by a thick tangle of vegetation or an expertly placed rock outcropping. The gold found there is said to be nearly pure, almost untouched by other minerals. Thousands of people, known as Dutch hunters, have since embarked on expeditions into the Superstitions, some dedicating their entire lives to the search. The search is not only a quest for gold, but a deep dive into historical context. Researchers pore over Spanish colonial records, hoping to find references to earlier ritual mines worked by Jesuit priests or Mexican explorers. They study old maps, often drawn crudely in journals or on scraps of parchment, which may or may not be deliberate deceptions. The enduring power of the legend lies in several elements that are perfect for quiet, historical contemplation. The forbidden landscape. The Superstition Mountains are associated with deep, unsettling Apache folklore and have claimed the lives of numerous searchers, some disappearing entirely. This danger only heightens the romantic, yet slightly unnerving, quality of the treasure hunt. The fragility of evidence. The entire story rests on the claims of a solitary, dying man. The evidence of the rich gold samples exists, but the precise location is forever lost to time, memory, and the desert's vastness. The contrast with the modern world. The idea that a vast, untouched fortune could still be hidden within a few miles of a major, modern city unseen and unclaimed is a comforting thought, a brief escape from the predictability of daily life. Beyond the Lost Dutchman, the frontier is littered with tales of hidden hoards. These often stem from the desperate circumstances of the gold rush itself. Imagine a successful prospector, perhaps one who found a rich pocket of gold dust, or a dishonest merchant who amassed a small fortune in bullion. They could not safely carry all of this wealth out of the territory, not through the rugged passes or the bandit-ridden trails. So, they would resort to burying their wealth often in cast-iron pots, leather pouches, or wooden chests near a distinctive natural marker, a strangely shaped boulder, a triple-trunked pine, or an ox skull carved with an X. Sometimes, the miner would be struck down by disease, killed in a robbery, or simply vanish before he could return to retrieve his savings. The location of the hoard would then exist only in his final, unwritten thoughts. As the wind murmurs over the ancient rock formations, let us transition from the silent mystery of hidden gold to the very visible, very tangible wealth of those who made their fortunes not by finding gold, but by selling the tools necessary to look for it. We have explored the grueling toil of the miners and the profound tragedy of those who failed to reach the gold fields. Now, we turn our attention to the handful of people who were not wading through the icy rivers or digging under the oppressive heat of the sun, yet who became the true predictable beneficiaries of the gold rush. The merchants, the purveyors of goods, and the proprietors of transient luxury. The core principle of this success is simple, yet often overlooked in the glitter of historical narrative in a gold rush. The surest way to profit is not by finding the gold, but by selling the shovels. As hundreds of thousands of people flooded into a territory almost devoid of infrastructure, the basic laws of supply and demand were amplified to an extraordinary, almost absurd degree. Every single item needed to sustain life or conduct the search had to be imported, often over thousands of miles, and every single necessity became a source of immediate massive profit. For those in a position to control the supply chain, let us focus on the merchant, the man who ran the general store, often operating out of a rough wooden shack or even a fortified tent. This system was rife with opportunity for the merchant, whose scales might be slightly weighted in his favor, or whose assessment of the purity of the dust was always conservative. The success of these individuals was not built on luck, but on logistics, control, and a ruthless understanding of market scarcity. The saloon was often one of the first and most elaborate structures built in any camp. The lighting would be warm, perhaps by expensive whale oil lamps, and a professional dealer or bartender, sharply dressed, would preside over the proceedings. The atmosphere was one of controlled chaos and temporary oblivion. The real profit here came not just from the price of the liquor, which was immense. Single, thin glass of common whiskey might cost the equivalent of a full day's meager wages, but from gambling, faro, roulette, and poker tables operated continuously. The games were high stakes, ruthless, and often rigged. This pattern of success profiting from desperation was a hallmark of the gold rush. The baker who charged exorbitant prices for fresh bread, the man who set up a laundry service, the owner of a simple boarding house offering a dry cattle, found stability and wealth where the miners found only uncertainty. The men who truly won the gold rush were not the lucky few who unearthed massive nuggets, but the disciplined, well-capitalized individuals who sold necessary goods, controlled essential services, and offered the weary, isolated miners a brief, expensive respite from the relentless truth of their impoverished, back-breaking lives. Let us now allow the muffled piano music of the saloon to fade, and gently transition from these material concerns to the vast, encompassing, and often tragic impact this human upheaval had on the landscape and its original inhabitants. The water was so forceful it could strip away decades of earth in a single afternoon, dissolving the landscape into a slurry. The goal was to get to the gold-bearing gravels deep within the hills, but the consequence was the creation of a vast, gray, toxic sludge. This slurry, containing mercury used to separate the fine gold and astronomical amounts of mud, flowed relentlessly downstream into the major river systems. This process had several severe and lasting environmental effects, forming the central tragedy of this segment: the rise of the riverbeds. The massive influx of sediment, literally pulverized hillsides, caused the beds of the major rivers, including the Sacramento and Feather rivers, to rise dramatically. This phenomenon, known as slickens, made the rivers shallower, wider, and far more prone to disastrous, widespread flooding during the winter rains. The natural rhythm of the water was broken. Agricultural ruin, the floods, combined with the layers of chemically treated silt deposited on the valley floors, rendered thousands of acres of prime agricultural land useless. The landscape was suffocated by the byproduct of the gold hunt, the mercury legacy. Perhaps the most enduring scar was the introduction of mercury into the ecosystem. In the absence of federal law and order, and fueled by greed and racial prejudice, massacres and systematic displacements occurred across the mining territory. The population of Native Californians plummeted dramatically in the decade following the gold rush due to violence, disease, starvation caused by the destruction of their food sources, and forced labor. Imagine the perspective of the Native Californian elder, watching in horror as the rivers, the lifeblood of their world, turned muddy brown. They fished, and entire hillsides dissolved under the violent spray of the hydraulic cannons. The period was marked by a total lack of legal protection for the indigenous population. State laws and vigilante justice often favored the miners, legitimizing the seizure of land and the brutal suppression of any resistance. The gold that was meant to be the salvation of the newcomers became the utter ruin of the first Californians. The legacy of the gold rush, therefore, is complex. It brought statehood and wealth to America, but it did so at an unacceptable cost to the environment and the original inhabitants. The scarred landscape, the mercury in the soil, and the broken social structure remain a quiet, persistent shadow beneath the modern Californian myth of boundless opportunity. We must allow these heavy realities to settle gently. The destruction was immense, but the silence of the abandoned mining pits and the slow, reluctant recovery of the rivers are a testament to nature's quiet persistence. Let us now turn our focus toward the social organization that emerged from this chaos, examining the unique, rough-hewn judicial systems that sprung up to impose some semblance of order. Imagine a newly formed camp of 100 men. They would gather, perhaps in the open air, and agree upon a few fundamental principles. Water rights. As water was essential for working the claims, rules were established for its diversion and use, a complex issue that sometimes led to bitter disputes. But for their perceived fairness, strength of character, and ability to keep the peace. When disputes arose, they arose constantly over boundaries, water, and tools. The process was swift and public. The decisions were final, and the speed of justice was paramount. The weight of this self-imposed responsibility was immense. This rough justice was cruel by modern standards, but it was also a reflection of the disparate conditions, and the miners' absolute need for order to protect their investment of time and life. This reliance on self-governance, however, often led to terrible excesses. The lack of standardized procedures, combined with the prevalent racial tensions we discussed earlier, meant that justice could be arbitrary and discriminatory. These men were not philosophers or lawyers. They were desperate workers who understood that without a system of rules, their entire enterprise would collapse into bloody chaos. They built their laws out of the materials at hand. Simple, common agreement, the fear of consequences, and the collective will of the majority. As the noise of the imagined courtroom fades, let us now leave the cold, hard laws of the mining camps and shift our attention to a truly contrasting experience. The life of the very few women who ventured into this rough, predominantly male world. We have spent much of our time among the rugged, desperate population of male prospectors. Now, we turn our gaze to the small, profoundly significant minority who injected an entirely different social dynamic into the rough-hewn canvas camps. The women of the gold rush. The overwhelming gender imbalance of the mining frontier ratio, often as high as 10 to 1, or even 20 to 1. In the earliest camps meant that any woman who dared to travel west found herself in a position of unexpected economic and social power. They were not simply observers. They were often the stabilizing force, the entrepreneurs, and the providers of essential, non-mining services. Most women who came to the gold fields did so not to wield a shovel, but to serve the enormous, untapped, domestic demands of the male population. These men were starved not just for food, but for the basic comforts, cleanliness, and civilization they had left behind. Consider the role of the laundress. Washing clothes in the camps was a grueling, constant chore, requiring boiling water, harsh soap, and immense physical exertion, all for little reward back east. But in the gold rush, laundry was a highly profitable enterprise. Imagine the price. A single shirt, begrimed with mud, sweat, and the grit of the river might cost $8 to $10 to be washed, starched, and ironed in amount equivalent to several days' wages for the average working man back home. The laundry woman, standing over a fire, boiling clothes in a huge kettle, was often making more predictable and substantial money than the miner desperately panning in the river. This work provided a sense of cleanliness and normalcy, a brief return to civilized standards, which the lonely prospectors were willing to pay dearly for. This principle extended to all forms of domesticity and food service. The woman who opened a boarding house or a tent restaurant was nearly guaranteed a fortune. Miners subsisted on monotonous, poorly prepared food. The opportunity to sit down to a meal of fresh bread, maybe a simple stew, and a piece of pie was a luxury they craved. Prices for a single, modest meal often ran into many dollars in gold dust. The most successful women were often pragmatic and entirely focused on the profit to be made from this extreme market scarcity. They provided a much-needed services, small, clean, warm space, a moment of conversation, and the taste of home, man. They were compensated lavishly for this stability and comfort. However, the women who gained the most notoriety and often the quickest wealth were those who entered the entertainment industry. The saloon owners, dancers, and performers. T.C. Werity, painted ladies of the gold rush, and their lives were complex, risky, and sometimes lucrative. They worked in the epicenter of the camp's social life, the saloons we discussed earlier. While their work involved inherent dangers and moral judgment from the more conservative elements of society, their economic position was often superior to the vast majority of men present. They were critical to the flow of gold, participating in or running the gambling operations, providing company, and ensuring the miners parted with their gold. In a world of extreme isolation, the saloon offered not just alcohol, but a temporary illusion of society, romance. We have followed the gold rush from its frantic beginning to the rough establishment of its social order. We now come to the final, quiet phase of this great historical fever. The decline of the easy gold and the painful, slow realization that the dream was over for most. The initial years, Tierra of the 49ers, were defined by the relative ease of finding placer gold, the gold lying near the surface, in the riverbeds, or in shallow gravel. These deposits, though rich, were finite, and by the mid to late 1850s, the surface gold was largely exhausted. The bonanza was over. The end of the rush was not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, steady leakage of hope and population. As the yields from panning and simple sluicing diminished, the casual prospector, the dreamer who had come west with a simple shovel and a boundless optimism, began to face a difficult choice. Imagine the atmosphere in the camps as the gold became scarcer. The initial camaraderie and excitement were replaced by a heavy, sullen silence. The work was just as hard, but the small flakes of gold dust, the color, were appearing less and less often. The high prices we discussed earlier now became crushing burdens. It was no longer a race for riches, but a simple question of solvency. Could you earn enough today to buy tomorrow's flour? Many realized they were working for nothing more than the cost of their daily bread. The most immediate effect was a mass exodus. Many simply gave up and walked away, abandoning their claims, their tools, and the broken promise of California. They returned east, often poorer and more spiritually exhausted than when they left. Others stayed in California but sought stability in the newly growing cities like San Francisco, Sacramento, and Stockton, taking up trades, farming, or opening small businesses, becoming the labor force needed to build the permanent infrastructure of the new state. This shift from mining to settlement marked the transition from a rush to a society. The mining itself did not cease entirely. It simply industrialized. As the individual miner disappeared, the age of hard rock mining began. This involved deep shafts, expensive steam-powered machinery, and the use of the hydraulic cannons we discussed. This phase required massive capital, organization, and engineering expertise. Mining transformed from a solitary occupation of luck into a corporate endeavor. The average man could no longer afford to participate. He could only hire himself out as a low-wage laborer for the powerful companies that took over. This marked the final, symbolic break with the original dream. The vision of a poor, hard-working man striking it rich on his own merit was replaced by the reality of wage labor under the ground, owned by distant, wealthy shareholders. Let us quietly reflect on the artifacts left behind when the camps dissolved. The landscape was littered with silent remnants of a failed dream. Abandoned rocker boxers, rusting picks, and shovels. Piles of discarded gray tailings, the washed-out gravel, and the skeletal frames of wooden shacks. These ghost towns and scarred hillsides became the quiet, tangible evidence of human vanity and relentless toil. The silence that fell over these places was profound, broken only by the wind moving over the desolate ground. The gold rush teaches us that great societal movements, while defined by their energetic beginnings, are often ultimately remembered for their slow, melancholy endings. The people who remained had to slowly, painfully piece together a functional, sustainable life from the fragments of the boom. They planted orchards in the valleys, built churches, established schools, and formalized the rough justice of the camps into stable county governments. The search for mineral wealth gave way to the steady, quiet rhythm of agriculture and town building. But the memory lingered, even today. The lure of that easy gold persists in the folklore, in the lost mine tailies, and in the enduring, ambitious spirit of California. As the gentle wind sounds of the high desert slowly fade, we bring our journey to a close. We have walked through the icy rivers with a 49er, felt the agonizing cold with a Donner Party, searched for hidden hoards, tallied the merchants' profits, and witnessed the ruin and subsequent slow rebuilding of the land. Take a deep, slow breath now, and feel the solid, steady ground beneath you. You are safe, warm, and comfortable, separated from the brutal realities of the 19th century frontier by the comforting distance of time. The dreams of gold and the hardships of the past are now just quiet voices and distant sounds. Let your mind drift away from the frozen camps and the dusty trails. There are no more demands, no more hard decisions, and no more aching labor. Who's to soft enveloping? Quiet. Thank you for joining me tonight on Boring History for Sleep. May your rest be deep and peaceful.